February 1945. Hürtgen Forest. American infantry were not losing because they lacked courage. They were losing because of a timing flaw no one talked about. Their M3 grease guns held 30 rounds. German MG-42s fired 1,200 rounds per minute. Every few seconds, American weapons went silent. And in that silence, men were cut down. Most histories blame tactics. Some blame leadership. Almost no one talks about the real cause, a gap measured in seconds. So frontline armorers did something that was never approved. They welded 3 magazines into one, 90 rounds, 30 seconds of uninterrupted fire. No reload, no pause. German prisoners noticed immediately. They counted shots. They waited for the guns to stop. They never did. They called it Endloser Sturm, the endless storm. This story isn't about a new weapon. It's about a crude, unauthorized fix that quietly rewrote the mathematics of close-quarters combat and helped decide how the war was fought in its final months. If you listen carefully, you'll understand why something this simple changed everything. By early 1945, the American infantry problem was already written into after-action reports, but it wasn't described as fear. It wasn't described as poor training, and it wasn't described as weak weapons. It was described in numbers. 30 rounds, 6 seconds of fire, 4 to 6 seconds of reload. On paper, the M3 grease gun was never meant to dominate a battlefield. It was meant to be cheap, easy to manufacture, good enough for mass war. At $20 per unit, it replaced the Thompson not because it was better, but because America needed millions of guns, not masterpieces. Against that logic stood the German MG-42, 1,200 rounds per minute, sustained fire from hardened positions, a weapon designed to do one thing perfectly: deny movement. In the forests of Western Germany, movement was everything. The terrain crushed visibility. Tree trunks blocked lines of fire. Snow and mud slowed advances to a crawl. Every assault required suppressive fire long enough for men to cross open ground, but American fire kept ending. Every 6 seconds, infantry doctrine assumed one team would suppress while another moved. But suppression only worked if it didn't stop. When the grease gun went silent, even briefly, the battlefield punished it immediately. Men weren't dying during charges. They weren't dying because they missed their shots. They were dying during reloads. That detail almost never appears in popular histories. Instead, failures were explained as tactical mistakes, poor coordination, bad luck, unfavorable terrain. But frontline officers began to notice something else. Casualty spikes occurred at the same moment, again and again. Magazine changes. A rifleman with an M1 Garand could fire 8 rounds, reload quickly, and continue. But submachine gunners, the men assigned to keep enemy heads down, had a deadlier problem. They were exposed while reloading. The MG-42 did not need to aim carefully. It only needed to wait. The Germans understood this timing instinctively. They listened for silence. Silence meant movement. Movement meant targets. By December 1944, this flaw became impossible to ignore. During the Ardennes fighting, infantry units reported repeated failures to advance against even lightly manned German positions, not because the defenders were stronger, but because they never lost fire dominance. A 30-round magazine could not sustain suppression long enough, not against a weapon that never seemed to stop. Ordnance officers studied the issue from headquarters. Committees debated alternatives. Testing schedules were drafted, but those solutions lived on paper. On the line, soldiers lived in seconds, and seconds were killing them. That was the paradox. America had the industrial advantage. It had air superiority. It had numbers. But at the point of contact, inside forests, ruins, and trenches, men were dying because their weapons paused. The problem wasn't firepower. It was continuity. How long a gun could keep firing without giving the enemy a chance to breathe. That question wasn't solved by doctrine. It wasn't solved by a new weapon design. It was solved by people who weren't supposed to solve it at all. In frontline armories, far from Washington, someone decided the rules no longer mattered. And that decision would change the mathematics of close-quarters combat. No order came down from headquarters. There was no directive, no blueprint, no authorization memo stamped in Washington. What happened next began the way most battlefield solutions do, quietly. In late January 1945, frontline armorers started hearing the same complaints from infantry platoons. Not about accuracy, not about reliability, about time. Men were asking a simple question: how do we keep firing longer? And why? The M3 grease gun was never designed to answer that question. Its magazine well accepted a single 30-round box. That was the limit. So someone stopped thinking like an engineer and started thinking like a soldier under fire. 3 magazines, side by side, welded into a single block. No springs were changed. No feed system was redesigned. Nothing about the weapon's operating mechanism was improved. All that changed was how long ammunition stayed available. 90 rounds instead of 30. At the M3's slow, deliberate rate of fire, that meant one thing: time. 30 seconds of uninterrupted fire instead of 6. It wasn't elegant. The weight alone caused problems. A loaded triple magazine assembly weighed over 4 pounds, hanging from a receiver made of thin stamped steel. Early versions bent magazine housings. Some cracked spot welds. Others failed under recoil stress. But armorers adjusted. They added reinforcement plates, welded steel braces, used leather straps or metal bands to redistribute the load. The welds didn't have to be pretty. They just had to survive a firefight. And once the first working versions appeared, the idea spread fast. Not through official channels, through word of mouth. A sergeant saw it work. He asked for one, then 2, then his entire squad. By early February, triple magazine grease guns were appearing across multiple 1st Army units. No paperwork followed them. No inventory forms tracked them. They moved hand to hand. Because they solved a problem nothing else could. The goal was never to reload faster. The goal was to not reload at all. During the most dangerous moments of an assault, a soldier would enter combat with the triple magazine already locked in place. If all 90 rounds were expended, the fight was already decided. Either the enemy position was suppressed long enough for movement, or the situation was beyond saving anyway. This wasn't a weapon for prolonged firefights. It was a weapon for crossing open ground without dying. German defenders noticed the change almost immediately. They had learned to listen, to count. American submachine guns fired in bursts, then stopped. That pause meant movement. Movement meant targets. But now the pause didn't come. Fire continued. Longer than expected. Long enough to keep heads down. Captured German soldiers struggled to explain what they were hearing. They knew the grease gun. They knew its limitations. But these guns didn't behave the way they were supposed to. They counted shots. They waited for silence. It never arrived. That was when the name began to circulate. Not in reports. Not in intelligence summaries. In conversations between prisoners. Endloser Sturm. It is. The Endless Storm. The fix had no official name. No designation. No place in Doctrine. But on the battlefield, it had already rewritten one rule. Silence was no longer guaranteed. And without silence, German defensive fire lost its timing advantage. What came next would prove that a crude solution was sometimes enough to change how men lived or died in close quarters combat. February 14th, 1945. Hürtgen Forest. Staff Sergeant Marcus Donovan had already done the calculations in his head. He just hadn't expected to see them overturned so abruptly. His squad had been pinned in frozen ground since before dawn. German fire came from a reinforced bunker position less than 30 yards ahead. An MG-42 controlled the approach, its burst timed perfectly to movement. Every previous attempt to shift position had failed the same way. Suppressing fire. A short advance, a reload, then casualties. This time, something was different. To Donovan's left, Private Donald Williams rose from cover without urgency. He didn't sprint. He didn't wait for a signal. The triple magazine grease gun hung heavy at his side, awkward and unmistakable. 90 rounds. Williams stepped forward and fired first. The M3's report was slower than the MG-42's scream, a deep, steady rhythm instead of a ripping roar. Rounds struck the bunker face in continuous bursts. Not accurate fire meant to kill. Suppressive fire meant to deny. 10 seconds passed. Williams kept firing. 20 seconds. The German machine gun faltered, then stopped. Not because it was destroyed, but because its crew could no longer expose themselves long enough to aim. Donovan felt it immediately. The silence was different this time. Not the silence of reloading. The silence of a pinned enemy. Move. Even. The order came instinctively. Donovan and 6 others left cover at once, crossing open ground that had been lethal minutes earlier. Williams continued firing, advancing slowly, keeping pressure constant. There was no gap. No pause where the MG-42 could reclaim the moment. 30 seconds. When Williams finally exhausted the triple magazine, the squad had already closed the distance. Grenades followed. The bunker fell. The entire engagement from Williams' first shot to neutralization lasted under a minute. Friendly casualties? 0. The difference was not courage. It was continuity. 2 days later, the effect repeated itself. Near the village of Schmidt, Company C faced a fortified factory complex. Brick walls. Multiple firing points. Estimated 40 to 60 defenders. Standard Doctrine called for artillery support. There was none. Instead, 4 men carried triple magazine grease guns. The plan was brutally simple. Sustain fire long enough for movement. Donovan and Williams established a base of fire from a destroyed vehicle 30 yards out. 2 more gunners flanked to the right. The guns spoke in sequence, short bursts, brief pauses, then more fire, not silence. The sustained pressure allowed the assault element to cross ground that would normally have been fatal. Windows shattered, brick chipped and cracked. German fire became sporadic, uncoordinated. Every attempt to return fire was answered immediately. Within minutes, American troops reached the structure. Grenades cleared the interior. By the time the factory was secured, the numbers told the story. American casualties, 2 wounded. German casualties, 14 dead. Over 20 captured. Prisoners were interviewed later. Several mentioned the same detail. They had counted shots. They had waited for reloads. But the American guns did not stop when expected. For the first time in weeks, infantry commanders began reporting something unusual. Advances without spikes in casualties. Assaults where timing favored the attacker. Positions that fell, not because of overwhelming firepower, but because firepower never paused. The triple magazine had not made the grease gun more lethal. It had made it reliable in the only way that mattered. It stayed loud. And on a battlefield where silence meant death, that difference changed everything. What happened in Hürtgen Forest did not stay isolated for long. Infantry units talk. They always have. Within days, reports began moving sideways through First Army formations. Not through headquarters. Through platoons, companies, and maintenance sheds. The pattern was unmistakable. Where triple magazine grease guns appeared, assaults changed shape. Not faster, cleaner. Company commanders started noticing something unusual in their casualty logs. The numbers dipped. Not dramatically at first, just enough to raise questions. Positions that normally cost 4 or 5 men to take were now falling with 1 or 2 wounded, sometimes none. The explanation was never written as innovation. It was written as observation. Enemy fire suppressed longer than expected. Place. Advance completed without interruption. End quote. Reload vulnerability reduced. I have. By late February, several regiments were tracking the difference deliberately. Before the modification, assaults on fortified positions averaged more than 4 casualties per engagement. After the triple magazine appeared, that average dropped. Not because German defenses had weakened, but because American movement no longer stalled at the same fatal moments. German defenders adapted quickly, as they always did. They tried shifting firing positions, They attempted staggered bursts. Some units began withdrawing earlier when American infantry closed distance. Interrogations confirmed it. Captured soldiers described the same experience again and again. They waited for the American guns to stop. They listened for silence. It didn't come. Sustained fire changed the psychology of defense. A machine gun position that expects relief through timing loses confidence when timing collapses. By March, the effect was visible beyond forests. In villages and towns, the triple magazine grease gun became even more valuable. Urban combat magnified the problem of reloads, doorways, windows, stairwells. Every entry point punished hesitation. With sustained fire, assault teams could hold pressure on openings long enough for grenades and riflemen to move. Rooms were cleared with fewer losses. Buildings fell faster, not because of superior marksmanship, but because defenders never regained the initiative. German forces took notice. Recovered equipment revealed attempts to replicate the concept. MP-40 submachine guns were found with dual magazine clamps, crude solutions, limited capacity. But the principle was clear. They understood the advantage. They simply couldn't scale it. By mid-March, First Army headquarters could no longer ignore what was happening. A field memorandum acknowledged the existence of triple magazine modifications. It did not authorize them. It documented them. Guidelines followed. Maximum weight, minimum weld strength, function testing requirements. The Army wasn't endorsing innovation. It was managing reality. By April 1945, thousands of modified grease guns were in service across First Army units, not standardized, not celebrated, just used. Maintenance reports noted increased wear, receivers stressed, more frequent inspections, but commanders accepted the trade-off. Extra maintenance was preferable to extra funerals. The triple magazine did not win the war. It did something quieter. It removed a predictable moment of death. It denied defenders the silence they depended on. In close-quarters combat, that was enough. And once that silence disappeared, the balance began to shift. Not in theory, but in bodies not counted. By March 1945, the Army no longer asked whether the triple magazine worked. The question had shifted. Could it be tolerated? From a technical standpoint, the answer was uncomfortable. The M3 grease gun had never been designed to carry 4 pounds of ammunition hanging from its magazine well. Its receiver was stamped steel, light, cheap, adequate, not reinforced. Armorers began reporting accelerated wear. Spot welds loosened. Magazine housings flexed. Feed lips deformed under repeated stress. Weapons that had once required minimal maintenance now demanded constant inspection. Receiver cracks appeared near stress points. Extractors wore faster. Feed ramps accumulated debris more quickly. In some units, maintenance hours increased by nearly 40%. Under normal circumstances, that would have ended the experiment. But these were not normal circumstances. Commanders compared 2 columns: maintenance, time, and casualty reports. The second column mattered more. A weapon that required extra attention but kept men alive was preferable to a perfect weapon that went silent at the wrong moment. Field memoranda began circulating careful, restrained documents. They did not celebrate the modification. They did not recommend it broadly. They acknowledged it. Guidelines appeared. Maximum acceptable weight, minimum weld strength, required function tests before combat. The Army was not endorsing the fix. It was trying to prevent it from failing catastrophically. Supply officers raised another concern. Each triple magazine consumed 3 standard magazines. That reduced the pool of spares. Some units responded by prioritizing the modified weapons. Squad leaders, designated suppression roles, entry teams. Not everyone received one. Those who did understood why. The triple magazine was not meant for prolonged firefights. It was meant for moments where reloads killed. When 90 rounds were expended, the engagement had already passed its critical phase. Either movement succeeded, or the situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. German intelligence reacted as well. Captured documents from late March referenced American automatic weapons capable of sustained fire beyond expected limits. Defensive recommendations changed. Positions were reinforced. Overhead cover emphasized. Withdrawal thresholds lowered. German units became more cautious at close range. That caution mattered. A defender who hesitates concedes initiative. By April, as American forces pushed deeper into Germany, the triple magazine found new relevance. Urban combat, cities, compressed space, doorways replaced tree lines, windows replaced bunker apertures. The same problem repeated itself. Movement stalled during reloads. The same solution applied. Sustained fire allowed entry teams to cross thresholds without interruption. The modification did not make soldiers braver. It made hesitation unnecessary. When the war ended in May, the urgency disappeared. Occupation duty did not require continuous suppressive fire. Maintenance burdens became harder to justify. Orders followed. Triple magazines were to be dismantled. Weapons returned to standard configuration. Compliance was uneven. Some assemblies were dismantled. Others vanished into storage errors. A few were destroyed rather than reversed. By late 1945, only a small number remained in official inventory. The Army moved on. New weapons, new doctrines, new wars. The triple magazine was never formalized, never standardized, never celebrated, but it left behind a lesson that did not disappear. In close quarters combat, firepower alone is not enough. Timing decides survival. And sometimes, the difference between life and death is not innovation in design, but the refusal to accept a deadly pause. When the war ended, urgency vanished almost overnight. The mathematics that had governed survival in the forests and cities of Germany no longer applied. Occupation duty replaced assault. Crowd control replaced bunker clearing. The triple magazine lost its purpose. In July 1945, directives were issued quietly. Modified weapons were to be returned to standard configuration. Triple magazine assemblies were to be separated. Magazines reassigned to general supply. The reasoning was practical. Sustained automatic fire was no longer necessary. Maintenance demands were high, and the modification had never been formally approved in the first place. In peacetime, irregular solutions become liabilities. Most of the triple magazines disappeared without ceremony. Some were dismantled by unit armorers following orders. Others were damaged beyond reuse and discarded. A few were miscounted, misplaced, or quietly ignored. By the end of 1945, fewer than 100 were believed to remain in official inventory. They were no longer weapons of innovation. They were anomalies. The Army had little interest in preserving them. Post-war doctrine moved forward, not backward. New infantry weapons entered development. Automatic rifles, belt-fed systems, and later squad automatic weapons promised sustained fire without improvised solutions. The lesson of the triple magazine was absorbed, but the object itself was forgotten. There was another reason the story faded. The men who used the weapons rarely talked about them. They didn't describe them as inventions. They didn't describe them as breakthroughs. They described them as tools. Tools that worked when nothing else did. Staff Sergeant Marcus Donovan returned home to Pittsburgh in September 1945. He found work at a steel mill. He raised a family. In his home, he kept a single photograph from Germany. His squad stood in the frame, tired and thin. Several of the men held grease guns with welded magazine assemblies. When asked about the picture years later, Donovan didn't tell stories of heroism. He pointed at the weapon. "That thing kept us alive," he said. Private Donald Williams returned to Ohio. He opened a hardware store. He lived a quiet life. When he spoke at local schools decades later, students asked about medals, about bravery, about fear. Williams answered with something simpler. He talked about sound, the sound of 90 rounds firing without stopping, the sound of time being bought. Officers who witnessed the modification's early use recorded their observations in personal papers. Some letters were archived decades later. A few photographs surfaced in museums, but none of it entered popular history. There was no dramatic invention moment, no official patent, no single name attached. The Triple magazine was the opposite of how wars prefer to remember themselves. It was crude, unauthorized, and effective. It challenged the idea that progress comes only from design bureaus and doctrine manuals. Instead, it suggested something uncomfortable, that decisive changes can come from people breaking rules under pressure, not to innovate, but to survive. Modern armies still operate on the same principle. Sustained, suppressive fire remains essential to movement. Technology has improved. Systems have become more refined, but the core problem is unchanged. When a weapon goes silent at the wrong moment, people die. The Triple magazine solved that problem for a brief window in 1945. Then it disappeared. Not because it failed, but because its job was finished, and because history often forgets the solutions that worked too quietly to be remembered. The Triple magazine disappeared. The problem it solved did not. Modern armies like to believe that technology erased the limits faced in 1945, that better weapons replaced improvised fixes. That doctrine matured past desperation. But at the core of infantry combat, the same rule still applies. Movement requires suppression. Suppression requires time. And time is created only when fire does not stop. After World War II, militaries around the world formalized what frontline armorers had discovered by accident, not with welded magazines, with belts, with larger feeds, with dedicated automatic weapons. The solution became official. Squad automatic weapons were introduced to do one job reliably, to maintain continuous fire long enough for others to move. The American M249 would later carry 200 rounds on a belt. German post-war designs emphasized sustained fire rolls at the squad level. Every modern infantry doctrine now assumes one thing without debate. Someone must keep shooting while others advance. What changed was not the mathematics, only the packaging. The Triple magazine was crude because it had to be. There was no time for redesign, no industrial retooling, no committee approval. It took existing parts and forced them to do something they were never intended to do. That approach is rarely celebrated. Military history prefers clean solutions, named weapons, official programs. It does not like hacks. But the battlefield does not care how elegant a solution looks. It only cares whether it works before the next burst of enemy fire. That is the uncomfortable lesson the Triple magazine represents. Progress in war is not always linear. It does not always move from prototype to production to doctrine. Sometimes it moves sideways, a shortcut, a violation, a fix that exists just long enough to matter. The Triple magazine never became doctrine, but its logic became permanent. Fire dominance must be continuous. Any predictable pause becomes a target. This idea appears again and again across conflicts. In urban fighting, in jungle warfare, in trench systems, where timing decides survival. Every modern infantryman benefits from lessons learned in moments like Hürtgen Forest, even if the object that taught the lesson no longer exists. There is a paradox here. The more professional and organized a military becomes, the less room it has for unauthorized solutions. Yet the problems that demand those solutions never fully disappear. Rules create order, but pressure creates exceptions. In 1945, those exceptions saved lives. They did so without permission, without ceremony, and without leaving a lasting artifact behind. Only a principle. That principle is still active. When suppressive fire falters, movement fails. When movement fails, casualties rise. Technology has reduced the risk. It has not eliminated it. The Triple magazine belongs to a narrow moment in time. But what it revealed belongs to every battlefield that followed. It proved that the most decisive changes do not always come from new weapons, but from understanding exactly where and when people die, and then refusing to accept that outcome as inevitable. That refusal is not innovation in the traditional sense. It is adaptation. And adaptation not design, is what keeps soldiers alive when doctrine falls behind reality. The triple magazine is gone. The lesson it forced into existence remains. Years after the war, the weapons were gone. The steel had been dismantled. The magazine separated. The modifications erased from inventory lists. What remained were memories, and they were rarely dramatic. When veterans spoke about Hürtgen Forest, they did not describe victories. They described waiting, cold ground, pressing through uniforms, fingers stiff from ice, the feeling that time was running faster than ammunition. Staff Sergeant Marcus Donovan never spoke publicly about the triple magazine. He didn't give interviews. He didn't write memoirs. He went back to Pittsburgh. He worked in a steel mill for decades. He lived the life expected of men who survived and moved on. But in his home, there was a photograph. It showed 8 soldiers standing together in Germany, their faces thin, their eyes tired. 4 of them held grease guns with thick, awkward blocks of steel hanging beneath the receivers. Visitors sometimes asked about the picture. Donovan did not explain the engineering. He did not recount battles. He pointed. "That's what kept us alive," he said. For him, the triple magazine was not a story. It was an object that marked a boundary. Before it, men hesitated. After it, they moved. Private Donald Williams lived quietly as well. After returning to Ohio, he opened a small hardware store. He married. He raised children. Decades later, he occasionally spoke at local schools. Students asked predictable questions. "Were you scared? Did you feel like a hero?" Williams answered honestly, "Yes, to the fear. No, to the heroism." When asked what he remembered most clearly from the war, he did not describe faces or places. He described sound. The sound of firing without stopping. Not the violence of it, the continuity. He explained it simply. As long as the gun was loud, we could move. 212. That sentence never appeared in any report. It never entered doctrine manuals, but it explained more than pages of analysis ever could. Officers who witnessed the modification's early use recorded similar impressions. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes, who observed one of the first test firings, later wrote that the weapon looked ridiculous. 3 magazines sticking out like a steel hand, he described. But what stayed with him was not the appearance. It was the reaction. Men advanced differently when they believed the fire would not stop. Confidence changed posture. Posture changed movement. Movement changed outcomes. That chain of effects is difficult to quantify. It doesn't appear cleanly in statistics. It doesn't fit into after-action summaries. But it shapes survival. Museums would later display a handful of triple magazine grease guns. They sit behind glass now, silent, disconnected from the conditions that gave them meaning. Visitors often see them as curiosities, oddities, crude improvisations. What they don't see is the moment before the modification existed, the pause, the silence, the seconds where someone stepped forward and did not come back. The triple magazine mattered because it removed that moment. Not permanently, not everywhere, just long enough. That is why the men who carried them rarely spoke of innovation. They spoke of relief. Relief that, for once, time worked in their favor. Relief that the sound did not stop. When history remembers wars, it often remembers weapons. But the men who survive remember something else entirely. They remember when the silence disappeared. Wars are often explained through weapons, leaders, and decisions made far from the front line. But for the men who fight them, war is experienced in smaller units of measure. Seconds, pauses, moments when sound disappears. In Hürtgen Forest, silence was not peace. It was a signal. It meant a magazine had run dry. It meant hands were busy instead of firing. It meant heads would rise on the other side. German defenders learned to wait for that silence. They did not need to overpower American infantry. They only needed to outlast their fire. Timing replaced maneuver. Patience replaced risk. The MG-42 was perfect for this kind of war. Its sustained rate of fire allowed defenders to control rhythm, to decide when movement was punished. Against that rhythm, the M3 grease gun was never meant to compete. It was adequate, affordable, and limited. 30 rounds created certainty. Every American assault contained a predictable gap. That gap was not a mistake. It was a feature of the weapon. And features, when repeated often enough, become targets. This is the part of warfare that rarely appears in narratives. Not bravery, not sacrifice. Predictability. Once an enemy understands when your fire will stop, they no longer need to guess. They simply wait. The triple magazine removed that certainty, not by making American weapons more powerful, but by making them less predictable. The silence that defenders relied on did not arrive when expected. That disruption mattered more than increased lethality. It broke the rhythm of defense. Men who are trained to act on timing hesitate when timing fails. Hesitation spreads. A gunner delays exposing himself. A loader waits longer. A position that should reassert control does not. These delays are invisible in maps and reports, but they determine who moves and who stays pinned. In close quarters combat, movement decides survival. That is why the triple magazine worked. It did not win firefights through volume alone. It won moments. It bought time for crossing open ground, for closing distance, for forcing the enemy to react instead of anticipate. This principle extends far beyond World War II. Every modern infantry doctrine is built around the same reality. Suppressive fire is not about killing. It is about denying the enemy the confidence to act. Once that confidence returns, casualties follow. Technology has improved since 1945. Feeds are larger. Systems are designed for sustained fire, but the underlying problem remains unchanged. When weapons go silent at predictable moments, people die. The triple magazine was a temporary answer to a permanent question. How do you prevent silence at the worst possible time? For a few months in 1945, American infantry found an answer that worked. It was crude. It was unauthorized. And it was effective. Then it disappeared. Not because it failed, but because the conditions that demanded it no longer existed. Yet the silence it removed remains a danger in every war that followed. Weapons evolve. Doctrines shift. But timing never stops mattering. The men who survived Hürtgen Forest did not survive because they were braver. They survived because, for once, the battlefield stopped punishing them at the exact same moment. The silence was delayed. And that delay changed everything. History likes clean explanations, new weapons, brilliant generals, decisive battles. But wars are rarely decided by what looks impressive on paper. They are decided by what happens. In narrow spaces, at short distances, when time collapses into seconds. The triple magazine did not change World War II on a map. It did not alter borders. It did not appear in victory parades. It did not receive an official designation. Yet it changed something more fragile. The moment when men hesitate to move. Before it existed, American infantry knew exactly when they were most vulnerable. They felt it every time their weapon fell silent. That silence created a rule the enemy could rely on. Wait, then fire. The triple magazine broke that rule. Not permanently, not everywhere, but often enough to matter. For the first time in months, American infantry could move without announcing themselves through silence. They could cross open ground without gifting the enemy a perfect moment. That did not make them invincible. It made them unpredictable. Unpredictability is what breaks defensive systems. Once defenders can no longer trust timing, they lose confidence. Confidence shapes posture. Posture shapes action. Action shapes outcomes. This is not romantic. It is mechanical. The triple magazine did not increase courage. It reduced hesitation. It did not make soldiers braver. It made survival less dependent on luck. That is why it mattered. And that is why it disappeared. Because the moment pressure eased, systems reclaimed control. Improvisation became disorder. Unauthorized fixes became liabilities. The battlefield moved on. But the lesson did not vanish. Every modern infantry formation still revolves around the same requirement. Someone must keep firing so others can move. That requirement exists because silence is still dangerous. Technology now hides it better. Belts replace boxes. Systems are designed for continuity, but the risk has never been eliminated, only managed. The triple magazine belongs to a narrow window in 1945, but what it revealed applies to every war since. That wars are not won by having the best ideas. They are won by removing the moments where people die unnecessarily. In Hürtgen Forest, that moment lasted a few seconds. For the men who lived through it, those seconds were everything. They did not remember innovation. They did not remember doctrine. They remembered the sound continuing. Because as long as the gun stayed loud, they were still alive. And when the sound finally stopped, it stopped on their terms. History rarely remembers solutions like this. They are too small, too inelegant, too quiet. But for a brief period, in frozen forests and ruined towns, a crude block of welded steel changed the balance of life and death. Not by overwhelming the enemy, but by refusing to give him silence.